Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Deuteronomy chapter 5 in our continuing study of the book of Deuteronomy. As we've noted, Deuteronomy is set up in 6 sections. We begin with the preamble, that's just the first few verses. And then there was the historical prologue, starting in chapter 1, verse 6, and taking us through the end of chapter 4. With that in mind, we come now to the stipulations. We'll be seeing the 10 commandments in this section, but then after that we'll see related commandments, and all the later related commandments we'll find the 10 commandments as their sort of table of contents. And we call those the stipulations. And that's going to be the whole center point of the book. When we get to chapter 27, there will be blessings and cursings, blessings if you keep the law, cursings if you don't keep the law. And finally, we see the succession clauses beginning in chapter 31 to the end of the book. What happens now that Moses is going to die? What will happen to that new leadership? And we'll read about that then. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 1, Then Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the ordinances which I'm speaking to you in your hearing. Notice, you're to hear, and you're to do that in order that you might learn them and that you might observe them. So notice the verbs hear, learn, observe. That word observe is the Hebrew word shamar. Observe works, although you could actually have translated that to guard it. Guard them carefully. It's the same word that was used back when Adam was first placed in the garden to keep the garden. You know, you're to keep his commands. You're to guard the commands. There's a sense in which Adam was placed in the garden to guard the garden, and so likewise, we're to guard the commands of the Lord. Verse 4, the Lord spoke to you, and this is Moses relating to the Israelites what God had done 40 years earlier. The Lord spoke to you face to face at the mountain from the midst of the fire, while I was standing between the Lord and you at the time to declare to you the word of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the fire and did not go up to the mountain. The Israelites didn't want to get too close to God because, after all, God is big and he's scary, and there's flames and fire and smoke and all these bad things. And so Moses had been the mediator. He had been between the Lord and the people, so that the Lord spoke to Moses, and then Moses turned and spoke to the people, relaying the Lord's commands. And notice he said these 10 words, these 10 commandments. The first 4 of those commandments are going to be toward God, so that we have no other gods, and there are a command against idolatry. God's name is to be holy, and finally the command of the Sabbath. The 5th command is interesting. We could actually, I put it in the column toward men, respect for parents, although it's been argued by some that that's really a commandment toward God as well, even though the parents are involved. It's as though the parents are the authority under God, and so showing respect for parents is tantamount to showing respect toward God. But I'm going to leave it in the column where I have it here, toward men. So respect for parents, and then no murder, and I'm trying to phrase it the way the Hebrew has it. No murder, no adultery, no stealing, no false witness, and finally no coveting. So the first 4, like I said, maybe 5 commandments, depending on what we do with that respect for parents, are toward God, and then the rest are toward men. Now, all of these laws that are given are perfect. They don't really need to be updated. They're good the way they are. They are spiritual laws. Yes, they have outward physical ramifications, outward physical applications, but they are spiritual. While some of them resemble laws of society, they far surpass those laws in their intent. If you doubt that, take a look at what Jesus had to say about them in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, don't murder." But I'm saying the real intent of the law is don't even think evil of someone. Don't speak evil of that person. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. And I'm saying to you, don't even look with lust in your heart towards somebody. You've heard it said, don't steal. And he takes it through each one of the commandments. It doesn't mention everyone, but we could take it through each one and show how the intent of the law is to go beyond just what the law says. that means that they have a corresponding corollary, so that when a duty is commanded, there is a contrary sin which is forbidden, and conversely, when a sin is forbidden, there's a contrary duty which is being commanded. When the law says, don't commit adultery, there is something positive being said about the sanctity of marriage. They are not merely a moral code, they are also covenantal stipulations, and as such they contain cursings and blessing formulas that are interspersed throughout the commands. So we start with chapter 5, verse 7, you shall have no other gods before me. Now, that's not implying that necessarily that there is the existence of other gods, although in that day and age people believed that there were other gods, and it had not yet been clearly revealed. No, those are just things of men's imagination, or wood, or stone, or sometimes maybe there were other spiritual powers. Remember, the Bible speaks of angels and demons, and so these other spiritual powers maybe were there. In any case, the command is that you shall have no other gods before me. Now, this command forbids atheism. Obviously, I am God, and so that's sort of an obvious point. But it also forbids idolatry, where they are not to be making false images, even things that might be, and this is going to be clarified in the next commandment, but it forbids idolatry, even things that might represent God. It forbids materialism, making a god of things. You ever see somebody who maybe, looked upon a possession, maybe a brand new car, with such great delight that it was maybe even akin to worship. The worshiping of money and of finances. And those are very shallow things to worship, and this command forbids that. It forbids spiritual carelessness, that we not be very careful about making God in first place, giving God our priority. It forbids selfishness, making a god of self, because that's what selfishness is. And it forbids pride, which is the corresponding quality of it's just selfishness under a different name. It forbids unbelief. And that's a sobering thing, because we all have a tendency to be guilty of unbelief in one way or another. The second command, you shall not make for yourselves an idol, or any likeness of what is in the heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You see, an idol, an image, is not to be made of God, because, first of all, because God is invisible, and secondly, because God has already made a great image of himself. And that image of himself is you and me. We were made in the image of God. We are, in a sense, a representation, a visual representation, just a little bit, of a part of what God is. Now, he's much bigger than, it's a scale model. It doesn't do the original source justice. It reminds me of on my 30th birthday, my wife went behind my back and bought me for my birthday a brand new car. It was sort of a sports car looking thing, a Firebird. Beautiful car. But when it came time to open the presents, I had this little box and was asked to open it, and I opened it, and inside was a model of a car. And I thought, well, that's interesting looking. I turned it over. There was a key on the bottom, and into the driveway drove the real car, of which the model was only a model. Now, we're made in the image of God. That doesn't mean God is like us. It means that there's just a little tiny bit, when you look at us, that reflects a little bit of who God is. It's a very, it's not a complete image, but there is something about us that we're made in the image of God. It's a fallen image, to be sure. And that means that idolatry is a breaking of this command, and a form of idolatry is spiritual adultery. That is, when we make an image of God, when we put something else in place of God, we are not just breaking the commandment, but we are engaging in a spiritual adultery. We're being spiritually unfaithful to our covenant bridegroom. Jeremiah chapter 3. sort of fleshes that idea out. Idolatry is also the natural outgrowth of rebellion against God. Paul points this out in Romans chapter 1, where he traces the journey of those who turned from God and how God gave them over to follow a path of destruction as they rebelled against God. Knowing what God is like, they deliberately, and sometimes we deliberately, turn from God. Notice, you shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children. Now, when we read about God being jealous, people have a problem with that. But there's an appropriate place for jealousy. There's both a bad jealousy as well as a good jealousy. A bad jealousy is when you love somebody and you don't want them to have nice things because you want them for yourself. So that's a bad jealousy. A good jealousy is when you have a relationship, a special relationship, and you don't want to see that relationship shattered as somebody goes after a secondary relationship. For example, if I'm married, and I've been married 40 plus years to my wife, I don't want her to have the same relationship with somebody else that she has with me. That wouldn't be appropriate. That would be a righteous jealousy. I want her to love me and to have that special union with me that's appropriate for a husband and wife, and not with somebody else. And likewise, she doesn't give me any reason to be jealous. But God says, I'm a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, and on the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands to those who love me and keep my commandments. And notice the balance there. The judgment goes to the father, from the fathers to the children, to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. But the loving kindness goes much, much further beyond that, not just to the third and fourth generation, but to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Notice, those who hate me versus those who love me. There's no middle ground. Either you love God or you hate him. It's impossible to be just apathetic. You always love or you hate, whether you realize it or not. Verse 11, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. Now the Jews are careful about this commandment to the point where it has been customary among the Jewish people not to even mention, not to ever say the name of God. And so notice in our translation, you shall not take the name of, and it doesn't have the name of God there. Instead, it replaces the name with the word Lord in all capital letters. That's the editors telling us that the name of God is actually there in that passage, but they're not going to say it. They replace the name of God with the word Lord, or the way you say Lord in Hebrew is Adonai. So instead of saying the name of God, they would instead pronounce that Adonai. Adonai, your God, Adonai Eloheinu, the Lord your God in vain. And that you're not to take his name in vain. Now, I'm not sure that's what's being commanded, even though that became a tradition, so that by the time of the New Testament was written, that was the regular approach that the Jewish people and the New Testament writers as well took to the name. They actually did not pronounce the name. We find no place in the New Testament where the name of God is even written down. It's always substituted with the word Lord, or its Greek equivalent. Now, what does this command forbid when it regards not taking the name of the Lord in vain? First of all, it forbids the using of the Lord's name in a vulgar or a common way. That name ought to be special. We ought not to use it lightly. Secondly, it forbids the taking of God's name in a light or jesting way. I have to admit, I have to confess, there have been times in the past where perhaps I've told a joke and God was somehow in the joke. And I've been convicted about that maybe I shouldn't tell a joke like that, where God is somehow enters into that joke in a light way or a jesting way. It forbids insincere prayer. Sometimes if we're not careful, we pray regularly and we find ourselves repeating the same prayer. And I think some prayers are okay to repeat. In fact, in our church, very oftentimes you'll hear people utilizing the Lord's Prayer to pray, and I think that's okay. Jesus said to pray this way, and yet, if we're not careful, it can become insincere and something that we just do by rote. It forbids the violation of our oaths and vows, that I might use the Lord's name in the taking of an oath and the taking of a vow. And that can be such a danger that Jesus actually suggested, and James repeats it in the Epistle of James as well, why don't you just not take an oath or a vow? Why don't you just let your yes be yes and your no be no? And that way you actually refrain from doing that. Deuteronomy 5:12, observe the Sabbath day. We come down to the fourth commandment. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. And now notice, here in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15, this is a repetition of the law the way it had been given. And yet there's an addition. When we look at Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, where the law was first given, the law of the Sabbath, we read, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, all that's in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath, made it holy. Here we have an addition. Yes, you're going to remember, it's true, the heavens and the earth and how God created, but you will also remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So notice that the Sabbath was not just a remembrance for the creative event that we saw back in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, but also now in Deuteronomy, chapter 5, verse 15, there's an addition where the Sabbath is also used to remember the redemptive event of bringing forth the nation of Israel. So the Sabbath looks back to creation, but it also looks back to redemption. Now that brings up the question about the Sabbath today. Most Christian churches make it their practice not to meet or to worship on the seventh day, that is what we would call Saturday, but rather on the first day of the week. I remember I've been asked many times in the past, why do I worship on the first day? And my standard answer is sort of flippant. I usually say, well, if I worshiped on the third day of the week, I'd be the only one there. But truthfully, the reason most Christian churches have opted to begin, and this is a practice that goes all the way back to the New Testament. You can look in the book of Acts and in the epistles and see some evidence there that from day one, the church began to meet on the first day of the week. And yet there's not a command that they have to do it that way. In fact, Paul says, look, one person looks at one day above another one it seems all day alike. Let each one be fully persuaded in his own mind. And so if there's a church out there, and I've got a friend who's a rabbinic messianic pastor, and his assembly meets on the seventh day, and I think good for them. And my church meets on the first day of the week, and I think, well, good for them. And historically why that takes place is because of the resurrection. That greater redemptive event, greater than the establishment of the nation of Israel, which, remember Deuteronomy, we just read that Deuteronomy remembers that, but the greater redemptive event was what took place in the death, burial, and especially the resurrection of Jesus. And so because of that, there's a new rest into which we've entered. And so it has become the practice, and I'm not saying that you have to do it this way, but it's a practice of the church throughout most of Christian history to meet on the first day of the week. The next commandment, chapter 5, verse 16, honor your father and your mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you. And notice there's something added this time, that your days may be prolonged. There's a promise that goes with this, that your days may be prolonged, and that it may go well with you in the land which the Lord your God gives you. To honor father and mother. I would suggest that this includes a respect for all authority. That this call for honoring reminds us that there are certain peoples, there are certain situations, there are certain places where authority has been established by God and ought to be honored, whether it's father and mother or those political fathers and mothers, presidents and kings and governors and things like that, judges, and that God has established authority to be honored. Now, the last 5 of the commandments, and we're going to go through these very quickly, they're joined with the vav conjunctive, the little Hebrew word and. So, honor your father and mother, and then the explanation was given, and now we read no murder, and no adultery, and no stealing, and no bearing of false witness, and no coveting. Very quickly. It's almost like, bullet points, and that's why I put them up here. Very quickly, no murder, no adultery, no stealing, no bearing false witness, no coveting. And yet, each one of these, I would suggest, have with them a positive principle. When God says no murder, that's establishing a respect for life and a care for life that we ought to have. No adultery is establishing a law that marriage is appropriate and it's ordained by God and ought to be preserved and protected. No stealing actually ordains this idea that it's appropriate for people to have possessions, the right to ownership of possessions. But also, I think, we're called, in Ephesians chapter 4 actually calls, let him who stole steal no more, but rather work with his hands so that he may be able to provide to those in need. And so it's not just a right of ownership, but it's the opportunity to share with others. No bearing of false witness means that we ought to be truth tellers in what we do and what we say. I would even say what we post on social media ought to be the truth, and we have to check things out like that. And finally, no coveting. Now notice this last one, verse 21. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and you shall not desire your neighbor's house, his field, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. And there's a sense in which whenever you covet, you've already broken not just this law, but internally, mentally at least, you've broken one of those other commandments. What's wrong with desiring things? What's wrong with, well, I'm going to use the biblical word here, what's wrong with coveting? It's taking that which God has established and saying, I want that for myself. I want to be first place. I want to be God. Summary statement is given in verse 22. These words the Lord spoke to you, to all your assembly in the mountain, from the midst of the fire, of the cloud and of the thick gloom, with a great voice, and he added no more, which means that you shouldn't be either. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me. Sometimes we talk about something written in stone. The law was written in stone. It's not to be changed. It's not to be changed. It is there for us. Yes, even for today. And that's why you have every one of the laws of Moses are going to be repeated in the New Testament. Sometimes with a little variation, but it's not really a change. It's just something bigger came along. A bigger redemption, for example, in the case of the Sabbath. But stealing was wrong then, and stealing is still wrong. Adultery was wrong then, adultery still is wrong. Worshipping another god was wrong then, it's still wrong. And we're still called to be righteous because God is righteous.